Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Democrat Serve podcast. I'm here, as always, with my friend and former congressional candidate, former state representative, and retired police officer, and veteran, Robert Asencio.
It's a pleasure to be here with you. Let's get into it, man.
We're here today with longtime friend and mentor, Akeem Bergman, who is a co-founder of Bergman's Worldling, with also another great person and friend, Alex Worldling. And Akeem has a storied and fantastic background, is a top Democratic strategist, even though he'll never admit it, and just fantastic guy all around. So welcome, Akeem.
Thanks for having me. Always happy to help and happy to be on.
Akeem, can you start by, and I know we've had this conversation recently, but can you start by how you got into politics?
Sure. Yeah, I was the first person in my family to go to college out of high school, and I wanted to go. I grew up in Southern California. I wanted to go to the University of Southern California, and loved it. At the time, though, my parents were divorced. My dad started making too much money. Well, didn't making too much money. That would have been good. He started making more money, and he hadn't put anything away for school. There were no college savings, and I applied for loans, and because his income that year was too high, I got denied. And so he had to, scrounge together the funds to pay for my first year, and said he couldn't do that after that. And so in that time, and I know I don't look it, but I just turned 50 last week. It was 1992. And I was going to take a year at a community college and petition to get covered under my mom for financial aid purposes, so I could qualify. She was a kind of a struggling actress, and so that time though, there was a speech that my dad had, a speech from Bill Clinton that somebody had emailed him or actually or shared with him. It was an email at the time, and I read it. And I was like, man, I really like what this guy is saying. And he's talking about, expanding student loans, and that's good for me. And so, I called 411. I found the closest Clinton headquarters, and I went down to volunteer because I thought he was going to help me. And George Bush was talking about cutting student loans. So I got to do something about this. And I just fell in love with the activity. My first the first thing they asked me to do was go register voters. And I really enjoyed that process. Started working more on the campaign, canvassing, talking to voters, and, mobilizing Democrats to vote. And at the end of that, in November, in California, we swept the ballot up and down. Obviously, Bill Clinton won the race. We elected 2 U.S. senators, Dianne Feinstein and Barbara Boxer that year, because Feinstein was running a special. And, a member of Congress in my local area, legislators. And I met a lot of these people, and I thought, this is great. I was an athlete. I love the competition of it. Like you're going to work toward a cause, and you're going to get to the end, and you're going to win or you lose. And when you win, there's going to be great benefits for a lot of people. So it was meaningful work. And I just fell in love with it. And I wanted to be an entertainment agent, when I was in college, and I just scrapped that idea and went back and, worked my way back, got covered, first got student loans, worked my way back to SC and graduated with a political science degree. And then was able to, speak at my graduation about it. It was awesome. So, but just working in campaigns during college and then, found my way to Washington, D.C. for grad school and got a job at the Democratic National Committee. And by the time I was, 27, I was managing a huge portion of the paid communications program for Al Gore's campaign, which was pretty awesome. So although it didn't end the way it should have ended, quite honestly, but that's a story for, that's a longer story about the Florida recount that, is, maybe a little painful.
Well, you were there, like the movie Recount, you lived that.
Oh yeah, I couldn't watch that movie actually. I couldn't watch it because First of all, they gave, Dennis Leary played Michael Hooley and he had hair, which was just kind of disconcerting to me because I worked for Michael. But it was like too traumatic and too close to it. I ran the number. I was like the numbers guy. They called me. It was, I was in Jake Tapper's book, and because I was tracking all the ballots all around the state, from day one on the recount to through the overseas absentee ballot count and all that stuff. And man, I saw just a travesty, a democracy where, the Republican counties were counting ballots that were faxed in after election day as legitimate votes for George W. Bush. And then I knew I had a model projected about when we were going to take the lead when we were doing the statewide recount before the Supreme Court came in and stopped the vote. And we were within 100 votes at the time of taking the lead. And we were probably 2 hours away. And it was just this terrible. In an odd way, like there are things though that happened, which at the time, and there were things that happened because of that wouldn't have happened if Al Gore were president. But you also, I was thinking the other day, like we may not have had Barack Obama if Al Gore had won that election. Things kind of have a way of coming back around.
You mentioned that the Republicans were receiving accounting ballots that were faxed in after the election was closed or after the deadline was closed. Isn't that what they're accusing Democrats of doing?
It's interesting. In this day and age, 20 plus years later, I mean, like those things would have exploded mid worldwide issues. At the time, it was hard to get attention over those small things because we had these big recounts happening, the butterfly ballot in Palm Beach County and all these things. A lot of the focus was there in Palm and Broward and Miami-Dade. And so these things that were happening in North Florida that were adding like a dozen votes here or, 5 votes there, nobody was paying attention to. And even, I don't even remember if it was referenced in the movie, but Don Van Natta was a reporter for the New York Times. And I worked with him on this huge expose that he did about a year after the recount, which I think was the sort of foundation for that movie. But he dug into it. But it's still, in terms of the total change in votes. You had a Republican staffer sitting in the office in Seminole County, making sure that the ballots were going to qualify by like filling in signatures and things like that. And then you had this ballot in Duval County that was 2 pages, but it said vote every page. And literally right there, we lost the election because there were thousands of voters who voted for Al Gore on 1 page and then wrote in Al Gore on the next page because the presidential ballot went across 2 pages. But yet the headline said vote every page. And those ballots were thrown out. It's crazy.
Wow. Well, so Akeem, Gore campaign ends, and then I probably fast forward a little bit. You end up at the DCCC working under Rahm Emanuel. How was that experience?
Oh, it was excellent because first of all, he's a tremendous strategist and a great leader. Just a smart tactician and very focused. And it was also very lean, structure in terms of the organization. Gave us a lot of ability to have a lot of impact on our campaigns. But that year was, people were fatigued with the Bush administration at the time. We had been in the minority for quite a while. So there was a real hunger among the voters for change. And I think we helped build some really focused campaigns and capitalize on that. We picked up 30 seats that year and won the majority. And the next year, there were another 24, I think, picked up the next year. But literally, like those 24 seats had people believed, and that was another thing that was hard for Rahm to try to convince people early in that cycle. And it didn't really start to like build belief until maybe the spring or so of 2006. But we were already past the recruiting phase at that point in time. And so, these days, like, having the quality of the candidate means everything in terms of winning and losing, which is one of the reasons, I really love what you all are doing with Democrats Serve, and helping to kind of build strong quality candidates. Because we just didn't have strong candidates in a lot of districts that we could have won in 2006. But at the time too, it was one of the things that we did very well was and this really was a combination of Rahm's engagement and recruitment and just the willingness of people to step up and run. But we had Democratic veterans, people who served in the Iraq War, running for office that year, which helped change the narrative a little bit and get a lot of attention, and help some of those independent voters to to understand, hey, like these scare tactics that Republicans use on Democrats not being pro-military or pro-veteran, that's bogus, because look at these people, who their candidates are. This is a person who was a combat veteran, who's a Democrat running for office. And so, that helped make a difference, I think.
Great background. And so can you follow up what happens next? Where does your trajectory take you to?
I manage campaigns all over the country. I went out and managed a race that almost beat Mitch McConnell, one of the closest races he's had. That was my greatest regret, is not being able to make that happen that year, because we've been stuck with that guy now for it's been 15 years now since I did that.
The Undertaker.
Could have taken him out then. Unfortunately, at the time, this was like pre internet fundraising explosion. So, had it been, 6 years later, my campaign would have had probably 4 times the amount of resources to spend. At the time, McConnell outspent us almost 3 to 1. He spent almost $30 million in that race, and he had to take out a $2 million loan to pay for TV for the last week of the election. So, the one thing that I think we did in that campaign was we kept him occupied to a level that prevented him from using his dollars in other places. And Democrats won the Senate that year with a supermajority. So that's when we got to 60, and we're able to get through Obamacare and everything because of that. So small role in that, but went from there to then getting into consulting and strategy on this side. My wife was pregnant, and I couldn't go live somewhere for 8 months at a time, which campaign managers do. And so I settled into managing direct mail programs and digital programs for candidates all over the country, which I love.
And actually, hey, Robert, for background here, I didn't know Akeem at the time, but a good friend of ours, Brad Katz, who managed that race, who Akeem hired to manage it, asked me to come out to Kentucky. So I was out there for the last few weeks and through Election Day. Small world.
In the Commonwealth.
Yeah, and Akeem, I want to make sure I say it on here publicly. I can't thank you enough, because I wanted to hear your story. I don't know the whole story of who Akeem is. I have to sit here now as I'm looking at you across on the screen. I'm thinking, are you really 50 years old? You exude the experience of a 100-year-old man in politics and the calmness of a child. But
vampires don't age, Robert. Vampires don't age.
That's right. This guy doesn't sleep, man. This guy's up like a pro. You can call Akeem any time of the day, and I haven't called. I tried not to call you too late in the night, but every time I call you, you have an answer. You're spot on. So I wanted to say thank you, man. And for background, Brett, if you indulge me for another minute here.
Please, yeah.
The way I'm introduced to Akeem is I received a call in 2016. No, I'm sorry, it was 2020, from a guy with a funny name, Akeem. And I had to go up and I had to look it up to see what the name actually means. In Hebrew, isn't it brother?
It is actually, yeah. It is. That's not the reason for my name, but it is, yeah.
I had to look up your name because I get this guy's calling me and he's asking me if I want some help. And a person that's always leery of somebody offering you something without you knowing them, I turned you down. And that was a big mistake I made in 2020. So in 2022, I received this call again from Akeem, persistent man, asking, telling me, I understand you filed to run for Congress. I just filed to run for Congress, Congressional District 28 in Florida, against Carlos Jimenez. I was a late file. We only had like
The last day of filing, right?
yes, yes. That's a whole nother story, right? We can do 2 shows on that. But the story being is that I am freaking lost. Now, mind you, I had already been an elected official. I had already served in the Florida House, had run one of the most competitive races in South Florida, let alone the state, let alone the region, against a guy by the name of David Rivera, former congressman. The guy ran out of ways to cheat. So I thought I knew how to campaign. So I get thrust into this race of running for Congress. And if it hadn't been for you, Akeem, we never would even get started. Because how do you get started? And that's something that I'd like you to explain is like your thoughts on how to get the campaigns up and running. Because I know that a lot of good people are sitting on the sidelines wanting to run, but scared the shit at the unknown. And thankfully, there are people like yourself with the smarts, the talent, the experience to, help persons like me rebuild its democracy. So can you just talk about that a little bit about like lessons learned and what people should know, what those that are considering to run?
Absolutely. And thank you, and I've said this to you before, but thank you for stepping up to run. You filed on the last day, and had you not, then like Jimenez would not have had to do anything at all. And that's a crime to me. If leaving a Republican in a competitive seat unchallenged is just not something that is contributes to victories anywhere, quite frankly. So I one of the reasons I love what I do, and one of the things I really enjoy is that building part. It's like a campaign is like a startup company that's only goal is market share. And so it's a little different in that regards, that like sometimes people who have been through the process of building a business, they're thinking through, long-term strategies and everything. Like the simple goal of the campaign is winning market share on a certain date. You need to get more votes than your opponent or opponents. But there are a lot of other elements about it that, like, you have operational items, you have all these different things that you need to build out. You need to make decisions on staffing and how much overhead you want to have. But again, always thinking through, like, your goal is market share. You gain market share through having a good product, which is you, the candidate, you're the product. One of my friends from Kentucky, actually back in Kentucky, he kept telling the candidate, "You're the box of cereal. You're the box of cereal. Stop getting yourself into all these other things. Like, focus on being the box of cereal." And then so a good product, which also includes the message, a good message and slogan to sell that product, but then advertising that product. And so campaigns, the general rule of thumb is to build 70 to 80% of your budget, focused on communicating. And so there's that makes it, it requires campaigns to be lean and efficient in terms of their overhead, but there's a lot to build, and you have to build it very quickly. So we first of all, we're very, like, it's one of the things that is just so important about what organizations like Democrats Serve, or Emily's List, or 314 Action, or some of these other organizations that work with candidates to help them get going, supplying them with support and information. It's so meaningful, because, as you said, there are people sitting on the sidelines because they don't know where to start, and so those organizations can do a lot of help. But also, what we do as consultants, people like myself and other colleagues, like, our objective is to help people get elected. That's why we're here. I'm not, I have my own ideals about policy objectives and things, but like I help accomplish those by getting good people into office to go do those things. And so, most people like myself, we don't cost anything to start. It's sort of an industry that's built on spec in a way, where we engage with the campaign. There's no charge, there's no fee, there's nothing to engage our services. And sometimes, it's a little bit of a roll of the dice for us as a business, because, like, this is a for-profit business that we have salaries and other things that we need to pay for. And so we need to make some revenue, but it's a bit of a roll of the dice, because sometimes the candidate will have a budget and other times they won't. But it's again about building a good competitive campaign and getting someone elected. And so that start is we often, and I know, like organizations we work with like yours and others, will have a set of kind of items that like a checklist to go through about what you need to do to get going. And there are a lot of just basic mechanical items, but it's also then like putting together what is the narrative, what is the reason for running, and kind of working to qualify yourself in the sort of three pillars that I believe makes for a compelling candidate that other people will invest in and support. And that is a candidate who has a good story and narrative and will connect well with the voters. So that quality of candidate we talked about before, and that the quality of the product. So it's an intangible. Not everybody. Some people want to run for office, and depending on where they're looking to run, some people they just there may be someone who has a stronger, more compelling story than they do. But then the second pillar is the candidate's ability and success with connecting with the sort of base, the activists, the supported, in our party, the Democratic activists, progressives, organized labor, other institutions and supporters that comprise the foundation of the Democratic Party. And so their ability to connect with those folks and to activate them, because campaigns, no matter how much money you have, campaigns are more successful when you have a groundswell of support from below that is lifting up the candidate and propelling them. And then the third pillar are the resources. Like being able to tap into the donor community and raise the resources to be able to communicate a message. And so those are the three fundamental kind of pillars, I believe, and they all work together. And other organizations that evaluate candidates and endorse them and support them and provide financial contributions. They'll tend to look at those three elements. Sometimes they'll weight one more than the other. I think there's a sort of a prevailing thought over a few years that the DCCC, and this isn't the thought now, but that the DCCC was kind of putting too much emphasis on the resources part of that, and that we had some candidates that had a lot of money, but they weren't a great quality of candidate. They weren't compelling. They didn't have a great narrative, or they flew off the handle and insulted the Republican on TV, whatever. They weren't disciplined candidates, and they weren't a high level, high quality candidate, but they had a lot of money, and there was a criticism about the organization that was too much emphasis on that. And I think over the last few cycles, there's been a lot more of a balance about that in terms of the national organizations approaching Democratic campaigns, realizing that you need a good product, you need to have a good candidate. And the money will come if the race is competitive. So there's a bit more balance, which is good. But like as you're building a campaign as a first-time candidate or a first-time candidate for a particular office, your goal should be to fulfill those three, like kind of build from those three pillars. To show why you're a good candidate and why you have a compelling narrative and a compelling message to connect with voters, which is something you had, was a tremendous advantage of yours, Robert, when you were running. And then then the candidate's ability to connect with the activists. That takes a lot of political work. That takes a lot of individual one-on-one meetings from the candidate to those folks. A lot of phone calls, reaching out, building support and advocates within that community to go proselytize on behalf of that candidate to others within the activist and labor and other organizations. And then the resources, that just takes time for the most part. And donors will invest in a candidate they feel will be successful. Obviously, it helps as a candidate to already have a big network of your own. And some candidates get into a race and they have spent 20 years cultivating a network of potential donors and relationships within their business or within the legal community or whatever it is, or maybe they're, maybe people that they went to school with that they've maintained relationships with over the years, and that they have a network that they can go to as for what we call the sort of first level of donors, like your friends and family. So the bigger that network is, the more money you're going to raise right out of the gate. And as we talked about that being like the third pillar here, that is also a way people keep score in a race where they kind of gauge somebody's ability to be competitive. And if you have resources to communicate a message, then that creates a snowball effect with other donors. So sometimes you could have the best story in the world, but if donors see, well, wait a second, they're not going to have the ability to communicate that makes donors hesitant to give then. So that starting point is really crucial. We work with candidates to put together their list, and in very detailed order, assign numbers to those people. And then it takes that candidates just the legwork to be willing to make the calls and ask those people to be supportive. In organizations like yourselves, like helping to build and add to that network is so critical as sort of a combination of like first and second level donors. So if you have the support as a candidate of a particular organization that has its own donors or its own network that can supply you with support or other people to call, that is a very soft. You've done call time, Robert. It's much easier to get a contribution from somebody if there's some sort of connection that they have to you, and you can say, "Oh, I'm endorsed by Democrat Serve," and they go, "Oh, that's great. I support them, and you must be great because they're supporting you," and so that makes it an easier ask versus just calling somebody and out of the blue because they've given to some other Democrats and asking them for money. But the thing with the fundraising part of it. I like to reference the Will Smith movie called The Pursuit of Happiness. There's a great line in that film where he plays it's a true story about a guy in San Francisco years ago who was homeless with his son and got a job at a brokerage and turned his life around. But there's a great scene there though when he says he realized that because he's cold calling people to sell stocks. And he realized if he hangs up the phone, it adds, X amount of seconds to every phone call he makes. So if he kept the phone to his ear and he kept dialing and he just used his finger to hang up and dial, then he could make, it was, he realized, and he called it's math. The more calls you make, the more people you reach and the more sales he got. And so he kept the phone to his ear because he could make, 30% more calls or whatever in a day. And so there's a whole science to the fundraising process too, to try to make it more efficient and to also keep the candidates, again, all respect to those who do this because that's not what I do, but keep the candidates successful in that call time process or in that fundraising process. So it does depend on what level of race somebody's running for, how much call time they have to do. You ran for Congress. That's a 7-figure campaign that requires a lot of call time. Some people run for city council for a city council race in a smaller district. Maybe they need to spend more time actually talking to voters. They need to raise enough money to be able to communicate a message to those voters. But it's a lot more face to face. When you're running in a bigger race like you did, Robert, you're not going to be able to knock on all those doors because we had several 100,000 voters. And so you need to be on television and be in, spending direct mail pieces and be in digital advertising, and that takes money.
And I think it's one of the hardest things that I've ever done. So I've been in the military, I've served in the police force, I've done quite a bit of things. I was state house rep, where I was able to walk through most of the district. Here I was run for Congress, so it was a short time, but man, it took every bit of energy that I had of scheduling the day so that I made sure I covered 7, 8 hours a day of call time, and then also made the functions and then made all the calls. And that's where I come into Brett, right? You introduced me to Brett. And another piece here that was so important and so critical to my campaign and the people that are around me, people still talking about this, because even though we lost, we still set, I think we projected the fact that you can win races if you put enough time and you got a good candidate and you got the great team. And Democrat Serve was part of that team and really got us up and running. And certainly with the fundraising, Brett, remember when you came down and you gave me the 411 on really call time, how difficult it was?
And making the ask.
Oh my God. Why don't you share a little bit about that, Brett?
Well, Robert, I commend you. I've never seen somebody with so much resilience and unstaffed. You were making 8 hours of call time happen every single day.
I just don't know how not to do it. I mean, if you're going to go in and I think that's an important thing for the candidates. Tell me if you guys agree. They have to come into this with a mindset of winning, and that they're going to do all that's required of them to win. You know, laziness, there's time for that after you, well, probably not after you lose. But if you win, no, you're going to have a lot of work. And so guys, why don't you guys talk about what we face now in the future and how Democrats will continue. Well, how do we take back the House? What kind of strategies are we going to have to employ to be able to be competitive in 2024 to be able to take back the U.S. House?
I think that it goes back to the earlier conversation about the quality of candidates and all these different elements that make strong campaigns. So taking back the House requires us to have very strong, compelling candidates in these competitive districts. We have to be, there are 60 or 70 districts, congressional districts around the country that will be competitive, and maybe at the end of the day, 30 or 40 of those will get a lot of resources spent on them. And the resources will be spent in places where someone is seen as viable and competitive, and that that is often determined by those three pillars I mentioned. Someone having communicating a really strong message and a quality of their appeal to swing voters, because in all these districts, there are maybe 15-20%, maybe 25% of the vote that'll go back and forth. That's really where the race is won and lost. And especially in a presidential year when both sides, in terms of Democrats and Republicans, they're going to vote. So for congressional races this year, it's really about this middle here, and so like organizations like yourselves, like that are focused on candidates that I think we've worked with a lot of people who come from public service. People who are judges and, firefighters and in law enforcement, like yourself, Robert, and others, educators, people who are really great connections with their communities. That is compelling to a middle of the road voter that is looking for somebody who is, those voters tend to look for, they tend to be drawn to people who are less political, because they're swing voters for a reason. They're not partisan. They don't like politics. They don't engage in it. They don't spend all their time watching Fox News or CNN. They spend their time going about their day, and then they get political communication, and then they make a decision based on who they feel most comfortable with. And so that, like, the types of candidates that you're supporting are tremendous candidates for those types of races. But then, it's also those candidates having enough resources to communicate their own message, because that is also part of this key. Because when you're running for Congress, it's not just your own. You need to build your own campaign and you need to communicate your own message. But most successful congressional races are also getting help from outside. yeah, they're also facing headwinds from outside. We had a client of ours last year who had just millions of dollars dropped on him by the Congressional Leadership Fund, the Republican Super PAC, and the NRCC, and he was successful, even though he was outspent, several to one. But still, like, you're going to face that headwind, and you need that support from outside in most cases to be competitive, and that's where those decisions get made on, okay, who is this candidate? How are they really connecting with people? How are they appealing? Are they motivating the people? And do they have enough resources to be competitive? And then those resources come. So, I'm encouraged by the new administration at the DCCC. In terms of this objective, I think there's smart people who are going to be there running the operation and making decisions. But like, it's February now, and we have a lot of primaries that happen in March of 2024, and so we need to be recruiting really strong, compelling candidates. And in some cases, there's a candidate who came really close last cycle, but narrowly lost, and they're a good candidate. And in some cases, there's a candidate who came close and narrowly lost, but really shouldn't be the candidate this cycle because they narrowly lost because they just weren't the best candidate for that race. And so I think they've got to be aggressive about recruitment and making difficult decisions, and then helping invest in candidates. And I'm hopeful that we'll have more candidates with public service backgrounds stepping up to run in primaries, because that background is just so appealing to an independent voter.
And Akeem, so we have obviously the House piece, and then the Senate side of things continues to be more and more up in the air. Do you want to talk a little bit about that landscape?
Yeah, I mean, it's I think there's a school of thought that we have a good chance of winning the majority back in the House. I think there were a lot of good campaigns last year, and I think smart decisions that helped win some races that people thought we were going to lose. I think the numbers last year were not as I think our a lot of Democratic polling. There was a piece about I saw today about there's no deep dive postmortems being done because both sides think they did well, which I think Democrats did. I was, obviously we lost the majority, which is not good, but I was going into election day thinking I'm going to be happy if we're down by 15 or 20 seats, quite frankly, given the wins at the time. And it turns out that some of our data was a little bit overly conservative. And I think a little bit of an overcorrection from the concern that happened 2 years prior when the data was overly optimistic and people lost races that they were predicted to win. So with that respect, our minority is the Republican majority, I should say, is slim right now. We don't need a lot to win back the majority, and we have some good districts. There's one district I was looking at recently that if the turnout was like 2020 was like 2020, the Democrat would have won the race. So we have those sorts of opportunities because the turnout is going to be different in 2024 than it was in 2022. But in the Senate, I think there's obviously it's such a critical chamber, and there's going to be a lot of investment in holding on to that majority. And thankfully we're at a 2-seat majority rather than being tied as we were before. But I think the map is tougher for us than the House map. And so, I mean, a lot of it, again, rests with the quality of the candidate. We have candidates who really fit their states well in a couple of the more conservative states where Democrats are protecting. And, if those candidates if they're running for reelection, we stand a much greater chance of holding on to those seats. If they're not, then I think, and I'm talking more specifically about West Virginia and Montana. If those senators are not running, then our chances of holding on to those seats is going to be tougher.
Yeah, and So 2024, it's a presidential, and we know that, well, after the State of the Union speech the president gave the other night, which I was very impressed, and certainly how he handled the Republicans and the hecklers, right? And so on the Social Security mainly, well, more specifically. But how much will that play into down ballot races? The president maybe rerunning for election.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly has an effect, and I think voters have over the last couple of decades become a bit more, maybe a bit more shrewd about how they're making decisions, based on the party, and you've seen some challenging splits for us, quite frankly, in some places where, where voters aren't, where like the voters in the middle of the road that we talked about before that are so critical are not just going straight down the ballot. They're not just saying, "Oh, I'm going to vote. I'm feeling like I'm supporting what the Democrats are saying. I don't like what the Republicans are doing, and I'm going to go down the line on this side, or vice versa." You're not seeing that quite as much, now, because you have voters who are saying, "Well," and I think part of it is, their opinions about their choice at the top of the ticket, and so I think you had a sense in the last couple of presidential elections, which may continue again in this election, where voters they make a choice, and they make a choice because they don't like, the independent voters, they don't like the Republican nominee, they didn't like Donald Trump. And yet, their choice on the other side of the ballot in 2016, they weren't enthusiastic about Hillary Clinton. Some were, but it wasn't like, the sort of energy that we had in 2008 and 2012 with President Obama. There wasn't that like, sort of, oh, I'm for everything that person is saying, that guy is saying, or that woman is saying. It was such a brutal campaign in 2016. That it was sort of like a lesser of two evils to some of the voters, and the same thing happened, I think, in 2020, and that's where you see quite a difference between what the top of the ticket and then down the ballot in some states, not every state, and this is and I'll talk about sort of the state specific stuff in a second because I think it's very germane to what happened last cycle, but California is an example. We do a lot of work in California. And in 2020, Gil Cisneros was a member of Congress who's now undersecretary of at the Department of Defense. He was a Navy veteran, tremendous guy. Had won a very difficult and challenging race in 2018, picking up a congressional seat that hadn't been represented by a Democrat ever in Southern California. He lost his race in 2020. And one of the reasons he lost his race was that notion that because Joe Biden won the seat by 10 or 11 points, but you had these voters who were going into who were marking their ballot and saying, I definitely don't want Trump. I'm voting for Biden, but I'm not sold on everything that Biden wants to do. So I want to sort of make sure that somebody's holding him accountable. And so they kind of mark the Democrat at the top of the ticket and they go down the ballot and they're voting for the Republican. And the same thing happens in reverse in some other places. But that's a real challenge strategically for us as Democrats to win in some of those places. In some of those states that, like California, New York would be another one where it sort of connects to what just happened in 2022, because some states Democratic turnout was abysmal, and California and New York were two of those. And we lost. We didn't pick up any House seats in California, or we won. We held on to one that we won in a special in New York State. But then all these other competitive districts we lost. It's because the turnout wasn't there in the midterm. It'll be there in the presidential cycle, but what we need to guard against is that sort of down ballot drop off for the party. In some other states where Democrats felt the threat in 2022, Michigan and Arizona and Pennsylvania are great examples of that. They felt the threat because there was a major race for governor. There was a and also in a couple of those big races for U.S. Senate. So there was a real threat that Democrats felt, especially about their reproductive rights and other things, that they were motivated to vote, and they voted. And those are the places too that are going to be very competitive presidential states in 2024, which means that there's also going to be, I think, another kind of psychological level of threat for those swing voters, and I think that we as Democrats need to be really cognizant of how to communicate a message to those voters when they're running for Congress or U.S. Senate, that helps to make those swing voters comfortable with them, and extremely uncomfortable with the Republican, just like they're going to be uncomfortable with Donald Trump if he's the nominee.
I believe, Akeem, you just laid out a strategy, right? And the strategy that I'm hearing is one that I heard recently. Thank you, Brett, for that podcast you sent me last night. It's phenomenal. The strategy of finding people that, although they vote against Democrats, is finding the issues or communicating the issues that really are not appealing to them or anti their views, and then bringing them over to the Democrat. But we can't do that without finding or running those type of candidates that will appeal to all. Is that what you're looking at?
Social identity over persuading, right?
Yes.
Or over persuasion, and then social identity over persuasion, in addition to a find and remind strategy, instead of trying to get new folks to turn out, which is easier in a presidential year than a midterm, but still a tough way to go.
I think that's right. We need candidates who voters, those swing voters are going to say, "Oh, I'm comfortable with that." Voters make decisions based on an impression. We tell this to all of our candidates because we do political communication, and we're trying to do everything that's driving toward creating this impression about our candidate and our opponent, and what that contrast is to make the choice easy for the voters. And so, and the impression may be constructed by 5 or 7 words in the voter's mind. When they see their name on the ballot, be like, "Oh, that's the woman who blankety blankety blank," right? And then they look at the Republican. "Oh, that's the guy who wants to do X, Y, and Z." And that's what we're aiming for. And so having candidates on our side that are that kind of meet the qualifications and the sort of comfort of the swing voter, which again speaks to the sort of backgrounds that Democrats serve, recruits, and supports, because for a swing voter to look at somebody who is an educator or a police officer or a firefighter, there's a lot more comfort in that identity versus some other backgrounds. And but then it's also that impression on the Republican. And one thing that we were successful in doing in the races, we were as a firm, we were I think grateful to not lose any of our incumbents last year. And there were still incumbents that lost. We helped pick up, we helped defeat Republicans in Michigan and Pennsylvania to flip, legislative chambers and everything, which is exciting. But holding onto all of our incumbents was, I think was really, we were proud of, and in part because we really disqualified the Republicans, because there's a sense among swing voters that there's a division in the Republican Party, which there is. There are some, sensible, I think, relatively speaking, Republicans. There's like the sort of kind of moderate, pragmatic types, and then you've got this growing swath of Republicans, the MAGA Republicans, that are taking over the Republican Party. So there are fewer and fewer of these Republicans that are sort of identified as being like, maybe somebody that people can work with. And so where we were able to, accurately label those Republicans as being over here, ideologically and, MAGA types, that's where, and we won those races. And other Democrats who defeated incumbent Republicans did the same in other places. And it's because that those swing voters, they're just not comfortable with that. That's not something that, even if they wanted to have a check on maybe they're not enthusiastic about Joe Biden, but they're just not going to be comfortable with that type of extreme ideology. I mentioned one of our clients who faced a huge amount of spending from outside. He was an incumbent member of Congress running against a Black female Republican in a district with a significant Black vote, and that created a real strategic challenge. But part of what we were able to do in communicating that contrast was a vast difference in terms of the priorities. We had one, our guy who was focused on the economic, on the economic health of his district and the people who live there, and then this woman who was focused on an anti-choice ideology, banning abortions nationwide. And so that was the core of our communication. And so that works, but it starts with us having our candidates having the right priorities and having an appeal across the board and being able to, kind of meet voters where they are. And then it takes, smart campaigns to illustrate that contrast between them and the Republicans.
Robert, what else did you find interesting about that podcast?
We often get caught up in asking why are voters not voting when we should be asking what motivates them. And that goes back to the strategy that Akeem was mentioning, identity, social identity versus ideology or other issues. I got to tell you that what I saw in 2022, and I'll come to the podcast in a second, what I saw was smart consultants that were helping whether retain seats in the Democrat side or pick up a few of them. And certainly Florida, we weren't on the latter part. We lost, but let's leave Florida out. Let's leave Florida out right now. What I saw was that you guys, Akeem and company, were the ones that prevented a red wave from occurring, because it was all pretty much, all the pundits were pointing to, and all the indicators and data were pointing towards a red wave, wipeout here. So I want to ask you about your thoughts on doing analysis of the district to better identify how people are voting, or what makes them vote, and then how do you convince the campaigns to go with those strategies? Because most people that are in this industry are pretty entrenched in those ideologies that those playbooks, they're played out, but regardless, they're still stuck on those playbooks.
Yeah, well, I think it does. Like you mentioned, the district analysis, and that's a really key part of where we start in any race. Even the beginning of a campaign. One of the first things that we do for somebody is we take a look at their district, broken down geographically, demographically, and then project a vote. And then what is the composition of that vote? How are those folks kind of split up? And then looking at, okay, what else can be done in terms of turnout? Who are the people left on the table? Who is, is like kind of predicted to vote based on, data modeling? Who's predicted to vote if they get a push? Who is just kind of, who do we think is not going to ever, and then putting the math together, and it's a vote goal scenario is the term that I learned, 25 years ago when I worked at the DNC and putting these things together. But like, how do you construct your vote goal? And part of that, a big is persuasion, as we discussed, and part of it is mobilization, adding to the pool. And in a presidential year, that part of it is, in my experience and judgment, less of an emphasis as the persuasion, because the presidential election is going to be mobilizing a lot of people to vote. There's still, a huge opportunity for mobilization and turnout within a presidential year, and there's still a need to do it. But in terms of the sort of weight that the persuasion takes on more weight in a midterm election, like we just went through, the turnout has a heavier weight than a presidential election, because it's just not something that most voters pay attention to. They're like very, the presidential election brings people out that never vote in anything else. And so, and even, like taking ourselves out of the national a bit, like municipal elections, we were talking before we got started here about municipal elections in Florida. Those elections have very low turnout because they happen in March of an odd year, or, June of an odd year. And so we go in my town here, we get about maybe 40% turnout in a municipal cycle, which is pretty strong compared to some other places when you have 75, 80% of people voting in a presidential cycle. So that all factors into the strategy, and then we communicate like what we put that together, and then it's communicating with the campaign about here, just based on the numbers, here's where our emphasis needs to be, and here's what we need to do, and then we can use all these data points that are added to the voter file, the voter data that we have access to then figure out who our best targets are for both the people to persuade and the people to mobilize. And then there's we also participate in an organization called the Analyst Institute, which is a fantastic organization that does studies of voter communication. And every year there are a lot of studies conducted about the efficacy of different types of voter communication. And one of the things that we took from that, from some of their analysis leading into last year that we employed was actually lowering the threshold of some of our mobilization communication, meaning like going down to people that would otherwise, like that we think would never vote because of how they're predicted, and how they're scored on the voter data, that they've never voted in an election, but like that the yield is actually not that different among those types of voters than somebody who would be, who voted in one of the last 3 elections. And so with the resources, with the campaign, if the campaign has the resources to communicate with those people, they should. And I think that's something that some campaigns have just been ignoring because they're thinking, well, it's just not efficient to communicate with that type of voter because they've never voted before. But so, again, though, like I use the term resources because a lot of it comes back to what do you have to communicate? Your startup company with your goal being a market share, the more money you have to advertise, the better. But most campaigns don't have an unlimited amount of money to advertise. And so you have to make difficult strategic decisions on where the emphasis is and what to focus on.
So Akeem, I mean, obviously your analysis and breakdown here is incredible. We don't want to keep you too long, but one little bit off the beaten path question for you. Without naming names, what is the most bizarre happening when you've been making recruitment calls or marketing calls? Like, what's the most bizarre call you've ever had go down?
Boy, I don't know. The thing that popped into my mind, and maybe it's because of all the George Santos stuff, was we were talking to a candidate, and I won't even name the state, so we protect identities. But somebody who wanted to run for Congress a few cycles ago, and they portrayed themselves as being a doctor, a medical professional, and we're talking to this person, and they seem like like very compelling, and we're like considering like kind of helping them get started, and then we talked to a couple other people about them, and it started to get some like kind of questions that were raised, and then we were talking to one of our colleagues at the DCCC that year, and she said, yeah, I don't think they're a doctor. And it turned out that this person had been like, kind of faking, their whole resume. That it was sort of like very Santos-like, I think. And thankfully, like that was spotted ahead of time, and there was more work that was done to sort of, verify things and everything. And then we were like, okay, not doing that, and then they got talked out of running. But yeah, it was, that was weird.
Yeah, lying to constituents or lying to people that you're working with or you expect to vote for you is not the way to go. I saw that. Did you see that exchange? Did you guys see that exchange on the floor between Mitt Romney and Santos?
Yeah.
He called him out as all members of Congress should do. One last question from me, Akeem. The landscape has certainly shifted, right? From 2020, actually from 2018, 2020, and now into 2022, and now into moving into 23 and 24. We have the R's, a certain portion of the Republican Party, the majority, certainly those that are elected, are really, really calling for extreme measures. The culture wars are really going strong. Does that help or hurt the Democrats moving forward into the next cycles?
It's a little convoluted because what I give Republicans credit for, and not all Republicans, but there is a strategy behind some of their madness that is trying to move people over here. In front of me, I'm moving to the right on the screen. I guess I'm moving to the left. But there, there's a lot of, I mentioned the people in the middle, and there's a lot of this talk that is about trying to move the center to our side. They're trying to move it to their side. And something that some Republicans, I mentioned Mitch McConnell earlier, and I don't care for the man's politics, but I do have respect for his ability as a strategist. And I use this example to legislative caucuses actually afterwards. When Barack Obama was sworn in, his approval rating at the time was in the 80s, in the high 80s. And there's and we hear a lot from pollsters and from others where we have to meet voters where they are. Right. And there's a concern about that a lot of Democrats have had where they say, well, voters aren't ready to hear that, or they don't want us criticizing that person because that person is really popular. And one particular state, and I'll just say it, is New Mexico. New Mexico lost they lost the control of their state house in 2014. It was a terrible turnout year. It was horrible. Year for Democrats here, but they lost control of the state house, and in part because Susana Martinez was governor, and she was seen as very popular, and there wasn't enough of a challenge to her, and there was a reticence to challenge her because she was seen as popular, and then that wouldn't be received well. And but Mitch McConnell, Barack Obama was in the 80s, but he was smart enough to know they'll get crushed if he stays there. They can't let him stay at that level, and so we need to just start going after him. And they started it. It was a political strategy, but they just started hammering the president, no matter how popular it was, knowing that in order for them to win elections, they need the voters to be here. And so that's part of what some Republicans are aiming to do with a lot of this kind of rhetoric, is to try to move the center over. I don't believe that it's having the effect that they want it to have, though. I think it's so far it's had the opposite effect. I think in part because of the individuals who are the loudest communicators about those sorts of messages and that are kind of becoming more identified as Republicans. Marjorie Taylor Greene now is one of the most well-known Republicans in the nation. And she's becoming more of the poster child for the Republican Party, which is a benefit to Democrats when it comes to those voters in the middle, because she is not somebody they're comfortable with or her politics. But it does take us as Democrats to understand that we need to focus on where we want voters to be when people make the decision. Back to the market share, we need to win market share on one particular day. And so we need voters to be where we need them to be to win that market share. But we need to, be very focused and methodical about that. And we also need to be challenging things and to try to move people over to the left before it happens. Sorry, you have a visitor here. Where we move them over to the left before it happens. So we can't just be kind of sitting back and saying, oh, well, we can't say that now because that's not where voters are right now. Like, we need to communicate about what what President Biden and the administration have accomplished. I mean, I agree with you. I thought the speech was very strong and very optimistic, and very very like about working together, and that is what people in the middle like and want to hear. They want somebody who's going to be paying attention to them. So sorry.
Do you want to introduce her or him?
She's getting a little impatient here, I think.
No, understand. Well, Akeem, a little bit of a lightning round before we go. Favorite book?
It's right here. Hang on a second. I read this a few years ago, and I would recommend it to everybody. Caste. It's tremendous. About really about it's about race and about and a kind of about the relationships between cultures, but it's really strong.
Nice. Favorite movie? Not Recount, I take it, but
no. I got to tell you, the first thing that popped into my mind because it was on HBO the other night is Trading Places, Dan Aykroyd and Eddie Murphy classic from the early '80s. It holds up pretty well. There's maybe a couple of elements of it that may not be accepted today, but it's a great story and very funny.
Favorite album?
U2's Joshua Tree, I'd have to say.
Nice.
Yeah.
Every track through, and I had the great opportunity to go see their anniversary tour where they played it, all the way through. It was awesome. It was actually my very first CD that I owned.
Nice.
Does anybody? Well, actually, aren't the albums coming back? The vinyls, or is that fading away now again?
No, there's like a nostalgia kind of a thing that's going on. Yeah.
Akeem, do you want to, for recording purposes, do you want to mention, in case somebody wants to get a hold of you, where they can, how they can get a hold of you, a candidate?
Yeah, sure. I mean, our firm is Bergman's Wordling Direct. It's we're on the web, BergmanZwerDling.com.
There's a lot more that I would like to speak with Akeem and like to have other shows, and hopefully you'll be back as we move forward in the upcoming cycles and we begin to feature more candidates and discuss more races from up and down the ticket. This has been another podcast from Democrat Serve. My co-host Brett Brosder, who is the executive director of this great organization, and I'm Robert Asensio. Look forward to seeing you guys next time. Thank you so much. Have a great day.